Please welcome the dazzling Maggie Gyllenhaal. You grew up in a household that was very devoted to drama with filmmaker parents. So beyond the obvious fact that this was a world that was familiar to you, can you talk, why do you think you were so drawn to acting?
I mean, I think that's interesting that you say I grew up in a household that was full of drama. Because I think that's true, in all ways. Why was I drawn to acting? I don't totally know the answer to that. I think it's true. It would be too much of a coincidence to say it came out of nowhere. My parents were interested in films, and I was sort of interested in what my parents were interested in to begin with. And I would visit them on set sometimes, which I always hated. And I still hate going to other people's sets. And I think it's because there's no room for anyone extra. I mean, there really isn't. It's like being in the army or something, like the way things are run on a set. But there was some kind of like magic thing about the actresses. And I remember, I couldn't have been all that young. I mean, I don't know really when it started, but I remember watching Barbara Hershey, who was in a movie with my parents, and like sitting on the ground, kind of hidden, and ultimately being told I was in her eye line. Which is so weird, that thing. I mean, I find, I'm going off track now, but I mean, I find like nobody's ever in my eye line. Unless I'm really distracted, anyway. But anyway, I was like mesmerized by watching her. And not just her work, although I think she's a brilliant actress, but also the kind of energy around her and around whatever kind of magic thing she was doing. And then I found, it was something I was good at. And there wasn't a lot of space in my family to not be good at something. Like I never really learned math because right away I was slow at it. It didn't come easily. And so I was like, okay, forget that, which is a drag. I don't think that's a great way to live. I think it's better to be able to struggle with something and learn something about it.
Well, a lot of your characters have a kind of real independence of spirit, and I'm wondering if there was a role or an experience where you decided this is definitely it. Acting is, where I want to go.
Yeah, but it's like so. I think in high school, I figured out. I had a great teacher in high school who like took us all seriously. And I figured out that I could express something that was important to me in acting. And like when I was first starting out professionally acting, there was no space for that. Like, you mentioned 40 Days and 40 Nights. There was no room in 40 Days and 40 Nights for me. I was a jobbing actress. I just took the job because that's what they offered me. And I didn't know how to put what was important to me into that work. So I would say maybe when I was like 14 and I played Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I was like, yeah, I'm like putting some weird, perverse darkness that I know is already in me and I believe is in everybody. I'm putting it in this play. But then I don't think I was able to really do that professionally until Secretary.
The role of Lee in Secretary kind of went beyond the cinema and it became iconic in a way. I know a lot of people who had that poster up on their walls. Did you ever have any reservations in taking the role, and why do you think it struck such a chord with audiences?
Well, I was 22. I feel like when you're 22, at least when I was 22, I was like, I don't have any reservations about anything. I can do anything. Nothing scares me. I'm way scareder now than I was then. But I think that's because I'm more in touch with reality. So, yeah, I guess I had I had just graduated from college. I studied literature, but it was also a time where there was all this like feminist theory and literary criticism that was like, tied to feminist theory. And I kind of half read it, like you do. But I was very devoted to making sure that this was a feminist story. And I thought that that's why I was making it. And it had a kind of, I thought I was making it from this sort of intellectual place. And then I realized, I think maybe not until quite a bit after I made it, that what was interesting and exciting about it was actually this unconscious, emotional thing that was happening to me as a 22-year-old woman growing into being a woman, maybe, and that's in the movie. And yet the thinking that I was doing about what was important and what needed to be expressed, I mean, it's also valuable. It's just not the most interesting thing. But like I look at this and I think a few things. I think I really do believe that both in this unconscious way that I was describing and in a thoughtful way, it was the first time I expressed myself, right? I was thinking about, I saw recently another clip from Secretary where the spanking scene where he spanks me, and there was this thing where every time we were shooting it, my hands were on the desk and James Spader would kind of come forward and put his hand next to mine. And every time we shot it, I would put my pinky around his finger. And I noticed, and it was important. It was important because it meant consent.
Yeah.
And at the time, I didn't feel confident enough. I was 22 years old to stop everything and say, hey, are you guys shooting this? But I told James Spader, and he told everyone else. And I was looking at that and thinking, that was my mind in that movie, and they did shoot it. And I do think it's important because consent is really important in terms of understanding what's happening in this love story. But then I look at this and I'm just remembering it and thinking, God, I had to do that perfectly.
Yeah.
Right? If I messed up that one long shot, the shot is ruined. And yet that's what the scene is about. And the ways in which I don't do it perfectly, like when I get to the door, I'm like a little awkward. And then I have to get in the right foot in order to close the door. That is actually what makes it great, right? Is the humanity,
Absolutely.
But I was telling myself, I remember as I'm watching it, when I was shooting it, like, I have to do this perfectly. But what you're really watching is like a 22-year-old who's not used to wearing high heels, trying to do this feat perfectly, which is exactly what the movie's about. So it's like that kind of meta feeling. And if you're asking me what made it work, I think is that it's honest. I think that's always what makes something work, is that it's trying to tell the truth about something. And I think people respond to that.
Absolutely. Well, you're 22 and you've suddenly got this kind of huge hit on your hands. What was it like? What was the industry like at the time for a kind of young woman who was coming through? I mean, were you well advised? And given what we know about, industry abuses of power, were you protected? And did you have good people around you?
Well, let's say that in a good way, the industry was totally different in that, like, if you had a script like this, you could go and get $1 million or $2 million to make your movie. It was easy. It feels like it was so much easier than it is now. And nobody ever would have made this movie with a totally unknown woman in the lead, or nobody would make it now. I think it was a different time. I come from a generation which is slightly different than I think the young actresses that are coming up now, and that, like, I assumed that there would be challenges. I assumed there'd be abuses of power, and you just have to, like, work your way through it. So I honestly, I don't think it was perfect at all, but I was respected. I was certainly really respected as an artist on this project, and I think I was shocked after this when I went into other projects and was like, well, here is my point of view, and here is what I would like to say, and people were like, I don't care. Truly, I was like astonished, because Steve Shainberg and James Spader were really interested in my work, even though I was very young.
Well, is there, what would you say to young women who now would like to do what you do?
I mean, I have to continually tell myself this too, but I think if you can get in touch with some sense of yourself, like sometimes I call it, this sounds so silly now in front of a group of people, but I used to call it me-ness, like what's on my mind right now. If you can get in touch with that, and express that, it will be compelling. It will not be compelling to everybody, and it might not make you any money. But I think it really will be compelling. And I actually think particularly now where in our country, in America, we're being lied to. And what's so interesting about that is that both sides agree. The right says the media is lying to you, and the left says, our leaders are lying to us. So we're sort of inured to being lied to. And I think when somebody does present something truthful, it's like people are hungry for it and they'll respond. And so going into an audition or something, you're saying like a young actress, to go and try to please is never going to be as compelling as expressing something about you.
Well, Sherrybaby, for which you were nominated for a Golden Globe, you give a beautifully kind of moderated performance in that film. Sherry is this kind of volatile cocktail of defiance and vulnerability. What are your recollections of the time, and what was the impression that she made on you as a character?
Sherrybaby reminds me in some ways of the kindergarten teacher. Just because of the way it was made. It was shot in New York. It was 22, 23 days. We didn't have any money. We were just like running and gunning and getting it done. And it's actually very rare to make a movie like that in New York now. And at the time, it was kind of like the way it was done. But I remember when I was making The Kindergarten Teacher and finding it painful and finding it difficult, I thought, oh yeah, Sherrybaby felt a lot like this. Where it's like you're like running a marathon and you can't stop. Okay, I'm gonna be totally honest with you about Sherrybaby. I was very young. I was 25, and I think at the time I thought that I needed, well, and it was also Sherry and who she was. I needed like an opposition. I needed someone to fight, I thought. And I really fought Laurie Collier, who was our director. And she took it. She was like, I really do think, she was probably 40, and it was her first time. She'd made a brilliant documentary, and we adore each other now. I love her. But I think in some ways I created that performance by butting up against Laurie. And like I say, she let me. We fought a lot about how to work with the little girl, which again, so interesting, right? Like that's the story of the movie, is who is in charge of this little girl? Who is her mother? Who is, and I think that's pretty, I think that's a sort of a young way of working. I think now in my own mind, figure out what my opposition is in the story of the movie. There's like a way of working where you sort of say, what's my obstacle and what is my need? And of course, whatever your obstacle is increases your need. And that's a very technical, way people work. And I like that. And when I feel confused and lost, I go back and I'm like, okay, wait, hold on. What's the event? What's my obstacle? What's my need? But at the time, I think I just made my obstacle Lori. but like I say, she was wise, and she held me in that way, which is really what you want from a director. You want them to be more objective than you, and especially playing somebody like Sherry, who's so confused, so young. You know, we also disagreed about something else. I think she wanted me to sort of act that I was this like hardened criminal who'd like done jail time, you know. And I thought the most exciting, saddest, most heartbreaking way to play this character is that she's like 16, like before she went into prison, before she started getting high. And she's like a baby. And she gets out of prison and she's like, okay, I am going to get a really awesome job. I'm going to have great clothes. I'm going to like get this apartment. I'm going to get my daughter back. I'm going to be the most amazing mom there ever was. And then if she starts here, to have her hit with reality and have to fall from as high as you could possibly start is a way more interesting narrative. And that took a little bit of convincing too, I think, with Lori. But I'm really, really grateful for her and how she helped me make that.
Well, the film has a certain frankness around sexuality, which is something that's a thread in a lot of your work, and certainly as a viewer, I think it's really refreshing. A lot of the roles that you played, kind of how bold they are in looking at kind of many facets of sexuality. Is this something that, why is this something that you are kind of drawn to?
Well, like I said, I'm drawn to, I'm very comforted by being told the truth, and I think by telling the truth. And I think sex on film and in television is a place where I think people do a lot of fantasizing, and there's a lot of sex scenes that don't look like sex that I recognize. And it also, I think, changes the way people maybe even have sex, right? If there's like a fantasy version that you're constantly seeing. So I like the provocative, especially when I was younger, I sort of think like, ooh, there's a place where you can get in and expose that this is not human and real. And look, here, let me show you, like, oh, you're expecting the Victoria's Secret ad, but let me show you like what I think is real, and how is that going to affect people, you know? I think, I also think, to be honest, there was some element, like, how do I put this? Like, okay, here's this interesting sex scene. Have I got your attention? Now let's talk about some of the really interesting things that I'm interested in talking about. You know, like it's like a sort of a way in, I'm just thinking, like, there's a scene in Sherrybaby that is so like a scene in the second season of The Deuce. Yeah. I think that you guys here have, if the second season is playing here, I think you've seen up to episode 3, where it's a very similar scene. In Sherrybaby, there's a scene where she's goes to get a job, and she says, like, okay, I'm so excited. I got my certificate, and what I'd really like to do is work with children, and it'd be great if they were between like 3 and 5, but you know, it's okay if they're older. And she just goes in so hopeful, and this guy is like, what are you talking about? I've got factory work. And she just switches and says, you know, like, I'll go down on you if you give me this job. And she's so like, what you see in that scene is that she's had to live this way. And then there's that scene just like it in The Deuce, where Candy is so hopeful. She's going to get her money for her movie. She's in like a great suit that she like laid down some money for. And she's going to talk to a legit producer, and it's going great. And then he says, I'll give you $10,000 if you give me a blowjob. And she does it. I thought a lot about that scene, having 10 years before played a similar one. I thought, actually, am I going way off track?
No, this is good. Keep
Okay.
going.
David Simon, who writes and is the showrunner of the Deuce, he came to me and talked to me about that scene, and he said, I'm imagining this scene, and I think she should get up and walk out. He said, I think, I'm not sure. And I said, no, she cannot get up and walk out. She's got to do it, because a couple of reasons. One is it's way sadder, but also I think probably most women in general and in this room, what Candy's asked to do is very extreme. But how many times have you laughed at something that you wished you hadn't laughed at, or put on a push-up bra for a job interview, or just been a part of a conversation that you then went home and went like, whoa, why did I do that? Why did I let that conversation go on? Much, much subtler versions of this very extreme thing that Candy's asked to do. I think that's like what we're all talking about right now in terms of, sexuality in Hollywood and everything. And so if Candy gets up and walks out, all of a sudden she's the superhero, and, she's better than all of us. And I just didn't want her to be that way. I wanted her to take it for the woman team.
Well, it's a very broad question, what do you look for in a role? But I wonder if over time you've developed a certain criteria for what draws you to a script.
It's interesting. Like I was saying, I used to, with a script I was working on, go through every scene and come up with the event, the need, and the obstacle, almost in a superstitious way, so that the work was under my belt. And as I've gotten better at my job, honestly, only very recently have I dared myself not to do that, and to just go with my instincts, which of course, even if I did do that with a script, break it down, do that very technical work, I still always went with my instincts. But there's a little element in some performances where I'm like gripping onto something I've decided before. Lately, I've just been like, what happens if I don't do that? What happens if I just, go from a more instinctive place? And I would say I don't really have a criteria for choosing scripts. I've always gone from a very instinctive place. I have made mistakes, and I've been really wishful thinking about something and gone, okay, in the best of all possible worlds, this movie could be great, which is dangerous. But mostly I just have like an instinct, and I just go like, oh, I want to do that. There's enough in there that I know I'll be like swimming in some really interesting territory if I take this on. Like recently I got offered this movie with an actress who I just have so much admiration for. And I started reading the script and I was like, it's not good. But I twisted it in my head. I was like, no, because maybe I could do it like this. Maybe I could come at it this way, because I really wanted to work with this actress. And about halfway through the script, I just went like, no. I can't hold this up anymore. This doesn't meet my criteria. And why? Because it isn't human, because there isn't space for humanity, I guess. And I was saying, actually, last night we did a Q&A. I feel like Sarah Colangelo is here, who wrote and directed The Kindergarten Teacher. I don't know. There you are. There you are. We were talking about how a bad or a problematic script, you get stuck into one way of performing it, because you're like, okay, if I grab this rung and then skip 2 rungs and grab this rung and then do a triple backflip, I can make this work. and you're locked into that. Or if you're working with an actor who isn't strong, you're like, oh, okay, I see. Okay, so my father is a robot. You're like, well, that's all I get to do. I get to do my father's robot. Whereas if you're working with a really, really good script, the mark of it being great is like, that fundamentally this is what the scene is about, and it can be expressed in 100 different ways. Mm-hmm. You could weep through the scene. You could very clearly and simply talk to the person across from you with absolutely no emotion. You could be trying to make them laugh. You could be, anything. Mm-mm. And it will tell the story it's meant to tell.
Frank is a fascinating film, and it's one where, as Clara, you have this kind of comedy role, albeit in a very kind of deadpan, kind of super dry fashion. I really like this scene because I think you get this sense of collaboration and of seeing creativity coming together. And I think you've often taken roles in interesting projects that kind of involve ensembles. And what are the kind of pleasures of collaboration for you?
It's interesting about Frank. I had a very little baby. I think Gloria was 7 months, which is a time when an ensemble piece is really welcome. I think I struggled on Frank to understand the tone for a while, and I was like sort of moving around and like, what are we, this tone or are we that tone? I would say the most interesting thing about Frank, as in terms of process, was that I imagined that it was, when I read it, and obviously I wasn't going in with like no sense of tone. I had a basic sense of what it was, but I imagined that it was this sort of lovers through time, soulmate kind of connection between Clara, my character, and Frank, Michael Fassbender's character. And Michael Fassbender was one of the main reasons why I wanted to do the movie. I think he's an amazing actor. And then I got there, and of course I knew on paper that he was in a papier-mâché head the whole time, but I hadn't totally thought that through. And so this like soulmate lovers through time thing was like definitely hit some roadblocks. And I found that what actually happened, at least in my experience, I don't know how much of this is actually in the movie, it's really actually more of like an audience question, but is that what it became about for Clara was the deep need and the deep desire to have this relationship with somebody who is inside of a papier-mâché head, which is much more real. And much more relatable, I think, and much more human. So that was one interesting thing, and then the music, of course.
Yeah. So we see you playing the theremin. Was this something that you already had experience of? Or?
No. Although my husband afterward bought me a theremin for my birthday.
Oh, cool.
That and also all the electronic instruments. The Korg and the Moog, and I learned a lot about that stuff. And we play all the music live. I mean, we had Carla Azar, who's the drummer, who's a real drummer, and she really anchored us. But we did play it all live. It was cool. It's great. I mean, it's like an extra challenge. It's an extra obstacle. Like I was talking about, it creates so many interesting things to be, focusing on something that has nothing to do with your emotional life, something that has nothing to do with like what you need in a scene, just getting the sound out of the instrument. That was cool. I loved it. I mean, in fact, somebody the other day in a Q&A, a radio podcast brought a theremin and was like, show me what you got. Can you really play the theremin? And I did. I mean, I was like, okay, wait, hold on. It was like this. I was like, wait, one hand is volume, one hand is pitch. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh yes, I remember. It was cool.
Well, when you're researching a role and finding your character, does music or art, photography, do you have a research process that you've kind of got into a flow with?
Yeah, I mean, I do have some kind of research process for sure, and there are things that you need to know if you're playing a sex worker. It is actually helpful to know how many men would they have been with a night, what would it have cost, what was the equivalence of $30 a night in 1971 to 2018. Where would they go if they got cold? Those kinds of things. And then there's all of the like imaginative work, like, did I ever turn a trick when I was nursing? And then you go like, can get to like really interesting places, So there's that, which I like more than the research. And I always feel like a bad student, although I don't think I am. I'm like trying to come to terms with that too. I'm like, I'm not doing enough work. No, I think I'm okay. But wait, there was something else I wanted to say about what you asked me.
Music.
Music. Oh, yeah. I think once you're in the groove, and I do find often I'm like, oh, I know I have to start working on this. I felt this about the kindergarten teacher for sure. I was like, oh, I got to start working on it. I got to do the event and the needs and the obstacles. Got to go to, and I'm like, later. And then eventually I just turn my head to it. And then everything is about that. Like if you're in love, every song, whatever song is in your head, you're like, oh, yeah. I had that with the Deuce, actually. Again, that same sequence with the blowjob and the guy in the office, there's an interesting thing that happens in that sequence where what I didn't say about the rest of that story is I thought it was important that you do it. Then I really insisted on, you must have a moment alone with her afterward. That is what will make it feminist. And then there's another scene after that where I'm alone in my apartment and I take the check out that I made for my movie. And I had this interesting conversation with George Pelicanos, who's David Simon's partner, who was in charge of that episode, where he wanted to cut the scene. I'm going to get back to music. He wanted to cut the scene afterward. And there are a few times in both seasons of the show where I was like, I can't, I'm sorry, I cannot let that happen, and I really was like, made my argument really intensely. And he was like, but I don't understand. You're sort of okay with the blowjob in the scene. Then we cut to you afterwards and you're upset about it in the bathroom. And then we go to your apartment and you're triumphant with this check. And the music thing was that in my head when I was doing the scene with the check, I had that Cardi B song, like, I don't dance, I got money moves. It was like in my head. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to buy both the Gucci shoes. I like pull out the check. I'm like, I made that money. That's mine, But the point was that song, having come into my head, having come into my life, fed that scene. And then I was like explaining to George Pelicanos on the phone, yeah, you're right. It doesn't make a natural linear jump from here to here in these three scenes, but it's a human one, and maybe it's a feminine one. I can switch how I feel. I can, be upset about it and then okay with it and then upset again.
I'd imagine that one of the pleasures of kind of long-form storytelling, like with this and with The Honourable Woman, is that you get to spend a really long time evolving these characters on screen. Is this something that you want to continue to be working in?
Yeah. No, I do think that's a pleasure. I will say, I had an acting teacher for many years, 15 years maybe, who died about 2 years ago. She was almost 80, and truly, she taught me everything I know. And the pilot of The Deuce was the last thing I worked on with her. And she's in my mind all the time. I mean, she's all over The Kindergarten Teacher. She's all over the rest of the seasons of The Deuce and all the episodes. And, she's in my mind. I think about emailing her all the time. I remember her telling me, and this is then we can take it. I remember her saying to me, like, this is where she was brilliant, and this is where you really get like expert level. You usually think like acting teachers will say, make your stakes the highest. Choose the hardest thing so that your need is really great. And so I was like, well, maybe like I haven't made any money tonight. I really need it. And I'm like, it's cold. I don't want to go back out there. She was like, yeah. Or maybe, you know what? You made all the money you need. And this is like one more extra go round. And it's incredible how that kind of a choice will change a scene. And actually, so it's like somebody saying to you, you can never start a sentence with but, you know, or like when you're starting, yeah. But then a little later, you're like, yeah, I can choose to have low stakes. It'll make the scene rad, you know? So that's Penny. That's Penny, my great teacher.
Excellent. Okay. Do we have some questions from the audience? If so, loads. Okay. Shall we start over here in middle? Keep your hand up. So, yeah, go for it.
Hi, Maggie. My name's Sarah, and I'm an actor. So it's been really lovely to hear you talk about stakes, to hear you talk about your needs, your obstacles, because obviously, like, doing the work, it's all part of it. Mm-hmm. But what really interested me is how you talked about lately being able to follow your instinct and showing the truth and the truth being compelling. And I was wondering if you could share a bit about what you do to be in touch with your meanness and your truth.
I mean, I think that's the most difficult thing to describe. I'm saying, okay, I'm letting go in some ways of some of the technical work, but it's not exactly what I mean. I actually had a really interesting conversation, like a sort of press conversation with a bunch of actors that they film with David Harbour. And he was saying it wasn't until he was about 35, 36 that he really learned to work. And I'm the same. I think around that time I really learned a process of work, which does include, I mean, just to go through a script, let's say, and say, what is the event of this scene? And that's the first thing, right? That will give you a point of view. The scene has these lines. It's in this context in the story. It's not obvious, but I'm going to decide, not randomly, because of the storytelling I want to do, that this scene is an apology. And that's not what I'm saying, but that's what the scene must do in order to fit into the story. You know, for example. And then you are a storyteller. Then if somebody says to you, I think you need to be more like this or do this or whatever. You have something to bounce it off against to go, no, that doesn't make sense. As opposed to maybe being pushed into something that you later go, why did I do that? That didn't make sense to me. You can have a sort of a point of reference. And then around the event, you know, you figure out what your needs and obstacles are. But of course, that is only the basis. And then when you get there, the idea is to just really go and see what happens. But that's right. That's the magic. That's the question. How do you really do that? Well, first of all, I would say something about the difference, the space between what the lines actually say and what you've decided you need to be communicating. If there's a difference, and I always find I'm like kind of dead if there's not a difference. If I'm just saying the literal lines and they mean the literal thing that they say, there's no shimmering space for in between those things. And that's where I think exciting stuff happens, where you're communicating something underneath the words you're saying. Like Chekhov, for example, you can't do Chekhov and not do that. You can read a scene in Chekhov and go, I have no idea what this means. I have no idea what this is even saying. You can't do Chekhov without what I'm talking about. But you can do like lots of TV and like lots of scenes in movies and not do it and just be on the literal level. And I find that's when I'm like bored, and that's when the work isn't good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question over here.
Well, and also the thing that you decide you want to be saying has to come from you. Right now, and I, right now in my mind, I'm interested in sort of this. So I'm going to make my event have something to do with that. Then I'm personally invested, and my interest comes into the storytelling.
Hi, Maggie. Over here. Hi, I'm Celine. I was yesterday at the screening of the film, and I thought about Lisa a lot during ever since I saw the movie, and I was thinking, she lives a life that is a life with a lot of routine, right? And all of a sudden there is this extraordinary event coming in her life. You said earlier that you like to give like a vision of a natural, more natural relationship, as you say, like when even like in sex scenes or something. But I was thinking, what is your? I would have thousands of questions on this movie, but what is your intake on precisely trying to remain a mom, a wife, and in a life that you chose that is precisely the country of mediocre? Because unfortunately, it feels like in the movie that her life is like going through something mediocre. So how does it work with you and stardom, like the fact that all of a sudden it's not like a mediocre life, it's something quite extraordinary for you?
I don't know if I totally understand the question. Like, how do I balance my life with my work and stuff, or more about Lisa?
It's more about to see on how precisely when something like that happened in Lisa's life, it changes completely her life, in the sense that she's capable of doing something even crazy. Now, for you, the fact that you were born sort of like in this industry from your parents, but like, do you think you could have like, how do you identify with precisely with how Lisa?
I see. Well, I think everybody can relate to the mundane, everyday elements of life: getting up, getting your kids to school, making their lunches, making sure they brush their teeth, getting on the train, getting them, whatever, like all the basic things that are life, even if my circumstances are very different than Lisa's, very different than Candy's, I think humans relate on many, many levels in many, many ways. I also think with Lisa, I think, I don't want to oversimplify this, but something about what drew me to Lisa had something to do with her femininity and her relationship to the world as a woman. And I think she is, like many of us are right this minute, waking up to what the cost is of having twisted ourselves into pretzels, bent over backwards in order to try to fit ourselves into what we thought we were supposed to be inside of our culture. And I think she's like, I can't take it anymore. She doesn't know that, she doesn't say that, but she spins out. And then the movie takes place over, 2-3 weeks, a very short period of time of having spun out, and she goes way out. And I won't give anything away, I know many people haven't seen it, but she goes way out, and yet I think if we're honest, even though, I can't imagine doing many of the things she does, I can relate to that feeling of like, I just can't take it like this anymore. I can't watch one more second. I can't be involved one more second in what we've all agreed to for so long. And then I would say the difference in her circumstances to mine, or maybe more interestingly, the difference between Candy's circumstances and mine, that fiction is what allows me to like have the courage to really get down and look at honestly at my relationship to these things. Having a little buffer, a little cocoon of that fiction it makes it safer.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one over here. No, wait for the mic. Go.
I'm used to shouting. I've got 3 kids. Sorry. Hi. Yeah, you talked about it really interestingly. I'm a writer and an actor. I didn't work for 8 years when I had 3 kids. It just sort of disappeared a little bit. And I was writing for BBC before that under a kind of pseudonym name. Not pseudonym. It was my name, but it was neither male nor female. And I never really thought about it. Danny Payton. I was just like, fine. I did sort of face Jacker and stuff. I'm just wondering about now with this Me Too movement and everything. And the last 2 projects I luckily just had were with Complicity and with another one were with women and very female-led. I believe that, we need both colours in the industry. I don't think one colour should fly larger than the other. Do you think, it's a bit like the Grand National, like, a false start, that there's going to be this kind of flood, an influx of kind of female writing and the opportunity for that in the industry with scripts that you get and the choices that you can make where you can say, well, I think that colours a scene because, like you were saying, that shows a female relationship to an experience rather than just moving a script along. Do you think this is going to continue or do you feel like that you've had a certain influx of maybe writers that are female or otherwise and it might just get taken over with something else? Or do you think there is really a new movement coming out in New York and London?
I think 2 things. I do think that there's a movement to a kind of affirmative action movement to bring diversity, both in terms of gender and in terms of race, into the entertainment business. I would say the Deuce, the second season of the Deuce, 7 out of 8 directors were women. Many of them were women of color. And I think that was a concerted, conscious, intellectual effort, political, intellectual effort, right? And I believe in that effort. I also think that there's a fundamental interest, and I don't think it's just among women, I think it's among men too, in an articulation of something feminine. And my producers are probably like laughing over there because they've heard me talk about this a lot. And I because it's really on my mind. Like, what is feminine filmmaking? I don't think that just because something is written or directed by a woman that it makes it necessarily feminine, because we live in a masculine culture. And at least in the States, I mean, it's become really clear that we live in a misogynistic culture. So it's difficult to create the space because it's new. And I think that women have gotten really used to, since we were girls, going like, okay, well, this is sort of not exactly natural to me, the way the story's being told. Maybe the most interesting character is a man. Maybe it's got a sort of fundamentally masculine take on things, but that's okay. I've got this muscle. I just exercise it a little bit, and now I relate to it. And I'm very grateful for that muscle. I mean, there's an incredible history of literature and film made by men that's fundamentally masculine that I would like to be able to relate to, and I do. And then I think about, like, seeing the piano, for example, for the first time, being like 15, 16 years old, and just going like, whoa, I haven't even used that muscle. And it's like an ease and a purity with which this is talking to me. Why do I still sometimes think about the image of Holly Hunter with her ankle tied to the piano at the bottom of the sea? I don't know what makes that feminine. I don't know why, but it is. Why, when I read Elena Ferrante, am I like, whoa, I never heard this articulated before? and it's strange and it's dark and it's upsetting, but I know it, and I'm comforted by seeing it put down on paper. So there's a mix, I think, of both. I mean, like The Kindergarten Teacher, for example, which was a script that went in that way, in that pure way, in that, I call it feminine way, naturally compelled women to work on it. I don't think we had a mostly feminine female crew, but I don't really think it was because we were like, okay, we have to make sure that we've got half and half. I mean, that was who was drawn to work on that movie. And the amazing thing too about The Kindergarten Teacher is I've heard maybe 4 men at this point say to me, I mean, I'm not a woman, but I really related to her. She, and for men to have an opportunity to exercise that same muscle is a great thing. So yeah, those are some of my feelings on that.
On Elena Ferrante, it's been announced that this will be your debut directorial feature, is adapting The Lost Daughter, and she has very publicly come out in huge support of you. So can you just talk about why you decided this was the project? This was what was going to be your first film.
Okay, well, like I said, I'm really drawn to her work. And I feel when I'm reading it, and I've read all of it, that I'm in wise hands. And probably wiser than me at this point. And so that was why I appealed to her to get the rights to The Lost Daughter. And this incredible thing happened even before that Guardian piece, where I asked for the rights to direct it, and the publisher said, we could see that connection, but it's really going to be her who's going to make the decision, and so you should write to her, because of course she's anonymous and I couldn't meet her. And I spent weeks writing this letter to her, not exactly explaining what the movie will be. I mean, I don't know yet what the movie will be, but what my fundamental interest was. And her response was, yes, and only if you direct it. And there was a point where I got scared, and as we were making the deal. And I mean, really, it was just my fear. And I said, well, but what if I don't direct it? What if for some reason, like, I don't know what, I can't direct it? And she came back and said, no. Well, then no. And I took that as a woman who knows more than me, who has been through more than me, giving me a push in an important direction. And I will say that as I've been adapting it, which has been an incredible pleasure, I think partially because my work is so often collaborative and fast. I'm like, okay, I need to make sure that I have this artistic little thing. Don't have it yet. So how do I speak to this person and this person and this person quickly in order to make sure that I have this thing that I need in order to do the scene I need to do? Time is money. Let's go quick. And to be able to work just alone with my own mind, and like you were asking, to just spend the time with the me-ness, as slow as I want to go, as slow as I need to go, has been like really amazing, especially as a mother of young children also, to just have that space. And to be having like a sort of fantasy, private communication with Elena Ferrante in my mind, because she's written the book, and know that I'm in wise hands in what I'm bouncing my ideas off of. That's just, I honestly, it's a place where that is the most pleasure right now in my life, and also feels the newest and the most exciting.
Well, we wish you all good things with this adventure.
Thank you.
The Kindergarten Teacher is going to be out in cinemas on the 8th of February through Thunderbird Releasing. We have one more screening happening during the festival. I think it's sold out, but there are always standby tickets. Thank you for being such an engaged audience, and please join me in thanking Maggie Gyllenhaal.